First, Zane, as you can see, I'm wearing black today because this is a sad day for mankind, for humanity. It's been a very sad week. We've lost a lot of ground as a planet, as a species, because of this Russian invasion and the consequences. And looking forward, it can only get worse until it gets better. And hopefully it'll get better soon, very, very soon. What is Russia up to? One of the debates is whether or not Putin is behaving rationally, whether or not he's completely untethered from reality. And there's a serious debate about this. There are some who are arguing that he's acting on the basis of Richard Nixon's madman thesis. Nixon said he learned from Eisenhower the value of irrationality, of acting like you're crazy so that the other side fears the worst and will behave accordingly. And Nixon said he learned that from Eisenhower's threatening nuclear weapons to end the Korean War, other things like that. And then Nixon employed that in terms of trying to force Ho Chi Minh to come to the negotiating table in Vietnam. And Putin's behavior seems in some ways so irrational that people think that maybe that's what he's up to with his threatening nuclear weapons, which we should get into shortly. But then there are some who say that he's completely untethered, and that we look at, for example, the things he was charging in the few days leading up to the invasion. The idea that Ukraine was run by Nazis and drug dealers, the idea that Ukraine was not an independent country, that Ukraine had no sovereignty, that it was always part of Russia. And his assumptions, seeming assumptions, that the invasion would go very quickly, that the Russians would be greeted as liberators, that they'd be welcomed with open arms, that Kiev would fall within 3 days, that there'd be very limited military repercussions for Russia, that the Europeans would be divided, that the sanctions would have little bite, that militarily the Ukrainians would collapse, that Zelensky would run and hide. I mean, all of these things turned out to be unmoored. And we saw those images of him with his advisors 20, 30 feet away. He wouldn't get close to anybody. Was it because he was afraid of COVID? Was he afraid of being assassinated? We don't know. But we also know that he cut himself off from the more reasonable advisors he had and listened to a handful of yes men who feared him and would not contradict him. And even his preparations, we see years of preparations in terms of shoring up the Russian economy, making it less dependent internationally, building up this massive reserve, and as well as building up militarily. But we've now learned that most of that was a sham, that half of those reserves are still in Europe and have been frozen, that the Russian military buildup was not what he thought it was, that this massive, efficient military that he thought he developed has not been able to function. Command and control has been inept. They've had that column, that 40-mile column, stalled for a week now almost, as progressing toward Kyiv, that they've been sitting there as shooting ducks, for the Ukrainian military, that the Ukrainian resistance has been so much more effective that the toll is taking on Russian military is quite extensive, that the West has been more united, that the sanctions have been much worse. So Putin's strategy here, but if we're going to take the other position, that it was rational, what Putin did, it's because Putin sees the way. There was an interesting column by Ben Aris, who begins by talking about R.D. Laing and R.D. Laing's definition of schizophrenia and insanity, basically, that from a certain standpoint, this seems rational based on the assumptions that people make. And Putin saw NATO expanding. He saw Ukraine eventually joining NATO. He saw increasing NATO armaments and trainers in Ukraine. He saw himself at a period of economic and military advantage, and he saw the West as being weakened in the aftermath of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. And Putin might have actually believed their own propaganda about Biden being weak and feeble and mentally incompetent, and the West was in disarray and decline. If Putin believed those things, maybe there could be a modicum of rationality. But what we've seen instead is a rallying of the West and a totally irrational behavior on Russia's part that is having devastating economic, moral, political impact. Within Russia itself, I'm in touch with a lot of Russians, and all my Russian friends are shocked and horrified by what's happening. Many are looking for ways to get out. The younger people see their future destroyed. They do not want this. And we even know that Putin needed to cut off all alternative sources of media and news and information because he doesn't want the Russian people to know the truth about what's going on. And so this is terrible for Russia. And there's a lot of opposition. It takes a lot of courage to protest in Russia. Yet we've seen tens of thousands of people come out and protest. So he's managed to unite the world against him. He's managed to unify NATO. He's managed to cause a lot of opposition in Russia, although obviously his approval ratings are still high. Rural Russians, older Russians don't want to, believe a lot of the Russian propaganda. But we know that Russians are deeply anti-war. That Russia lost 27 million in World War II. Russians don't forget this. World War II is still very much alive in Russia. So we've got a situation that benefits nobody except certain pro-NATO hawks in the West who wanted to bring Russia down and said, I've been predicting for a long time that this was going to happen, that Putin is evil, that Russia's a bad actor, that these intentions were there all along. And in some sad way, some of them have been vindicated by Putin's actions. So we've seen a lot of bad come from this and no good. But and in terms of what's playing out on the ground that you asked about, Russia is slowly, inexorably, ineptly, but still going in the direction they want to go in terms of taking Mariupol, taking Kharkiv, eventually taking Kiev. There's a certain fantasy in the West that Zelensky has rallied this tremendous Ukrainian resistance. And Ukrainians have shown great courage in fighting off the Russians so far. But the odds are so overwhelmingly against them. And so what they're being led to is a slaughter. There are many in the West, especially on cable news, who believe that the Ukrainian resistance will ultimately prevail, especially if the US and NATO continue supplying more and more lethal equipment, military hardware, planes, drones, missiles to Ukrainian opposition that they can hold out. They can hold out for a long time, but the costs will be devastating. We're already seeing the effects of that. I'm not sure what the wisdom is. Uh, if the ultimate solution is going to be that Russia prevails, that Ukraine is neutralized, that the Ukrainian leadership is toppled, that there are going to be tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands more deaths in Ukraine and more destruction, and we come up with the ultimate same outcome. I'm not sure what the wisdom is of encouraging this resistance if that's all that's going to be achieved. I know symbolically it's important. I know it's important to make aggressors pay the price, but they have to look at this in humanitarian terms also. And what we see day after day after day, the humanitarian tragedy that could eventually become a humanitarian catastrophe of a much greater order. So I'm totally distraught about what's happening in terms of the geopolitical ramifications, in terms of the humanitarian consequences, in terms of the military implications. The fear we all have is of this situation spiraling out of control, going beyond the borders of Ukraine, and leading to World War III, with the possibility of the employment of nuclear weapons. That's a nightmare scenario that we have to think seriously about. There are some people, some US military and former military, as well as a lot of political pundits and members of the foreign policy establishment, who are urging that the US and NATO create a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Wiser people, including President Biden, understand that that would lead to war between the United States and Russia. And they have said very, very clearly that this is not going to be entertained. If they create, we have been able to create no-fly zones in the past in other countries in much more limited conflicts. But to create a no-fly zone in this situation would be not only a catastrophic blunder, it would be a disaster. It would mean the US shooting down Russian aircraft, killing Russian pilots. We don't know that it would succeed in achieving anything, but the Russians would retaliate, and it would lead to, again, direct military confrontation and the likelihood of World War III. So people who advocate that, I think, are a little bit insane, including President Zelensky. You know, Zelensky has been heroic. He's been brave. He's rallied his nation in ways that many of them think he could. However, he's in some ways also delusional. He's been calling for things that will not only destroy Ukraine, but destroy much of the world. Even on the eve of the invasion, 2 Saturday nights ago, when he said that he no longer respects the Budapest Memorandum, I immediately warned that he had signed Ukraine's death warrant because it was going to be interpreted by paranoid Putin and others in Russia as him saying that Ukraine wants to develop nuclear weapons. I got a, I've been off Russian TV. I did so many dozens and dozens and scores of Russian TV interviews leading up to the invasion. But after that, as soon as I condemned Putin on RT and Sputnik, I stopped hearing from Russian media. But I did get a call a few days ago from a Russian TV network who wanted to interview me about stories circulating in Russia that the US had provided plutonium to Russia in order to help, plutonium to Ukraine in order to help Ukraine develop dirty bombs. And I said that is one of a series of rumors that are totally unfounded. The United States, as aggressive and wrongheaded in many ways as it was leading up to this war, would not have done something that dangerous and that provocative. And I don't know how much of it got on Russian TV, but I think that there is a lot of false information, a lot of warfare, communications warfare being conducted inside Russia. And the Russians, we know a lot of Russians believe that this is an attempt to denazify Ukraine and that somehow the Nazis are responsible for what's happening. Again, in craziness inside Russia. Uh, so, but the nuclear threat that we need to talk about is real. And Putin, that's part of why people think this madman thesis might be operative. From the very beginning, Putin started to make nuclear threats. Putin put his nuclear forces on high alert. The craziness about Ukraine developing nuclear bombs is giving a pretext to Putin, I fear, for use of nuclear weapons himself. The attack on Ukraine's biggest nuclear power plant, the biggest nuclear reactor in Europe, by Russian troops, again, is so dangerous, so provocative. The ability for that to breach the containment barriers of those nuclear facilities and spread nuclear radioactive waste throughout Europe and Russia and Ukraine is so dangerous that to do that is simply out of control. And for so Russia's behavior has been highly provocative and quite dangerous in this situation. And the West and Western experts are talking openly about the nuclear threat in ways that we haven't seen before. Maybe that's healthy, but in this circumstance right now, it is potentially devastating and catastrophic because it's so real. Because even if the US talks about supplying fighter jets to Poland, and Poland will sell its fighter jets, gives its fighter jets to Ukraine, Putin has said that even the sanctions are an act of war. Will US and NATO providing uh, more lethal weapons to Poland or Romania not be seen as an act of war? Will Putin not attack those sources in Poland and Romania? Will that not cause NATO Article 5 to be enacted and again bring us to a full greater war? There are no military answers. The West can bloody Putin's nose. Putin's military already has been compromised and humbled. The fear of Russia's great military prowess, the military machine, has already been discredited. In so many ways, Russia has hurt itself in terms of its reputation, its image, and capabilities. We don't need to inflict further damage. We don't need to further show how brave Ukrainians are or how willing they are to resist. What we need to do now is find an off ramp diplomatically. It should have happened before the war. I mean, what do Ukrainians gain ending up with neutrality after Ukraine has been leveled? So many of the cities, so many people are dead when we don't know for sure what Putin had in mind. We don't know if Putin would have accepted Ukraine, say, announcing before this started that they are willing to accept neutrality, that they do not want to join NATO, that they want their independence, they want to develop their own democracy, and they want to be given freedom to act independently. Maybe Russia would have backed off. There's no way to know for sure. It would have been worth a try. It would have been worth a try for Biden and NATO to give up their principle of an open door policy, and to say that we can understand Russia's national security concerns. Putin has been articulating that since 2007. So we can hear that. We don't agree. We think that NATO poses no threat to Russia, but we understand why the Russians might see it that way. And so we are going to suspend NATO expansion in exchange for Russia withdrawing the troops and looking for a diplomatic solution and sitting down and discussing a new European nuclear security architecture that represents the interests of everybody. We didn't. Biden didn't do that because there was all this narrative, especially in the aftermath of Afghanistan, about Biden's weakness, number one, and two, that you can't appease a bully. You can't appease a dictator. And we heard American leaders denounce any kind of appeasement, especially the Republicans, but also others. We heard that the British saying this, the Estonians saying this, no appeasement. Take the lesson from Hitler in World War II. Well, the reality is that Putin is not a Hitler, that Russia is not Nazi Germany, and that the world is much more awake to what this represents. And so we couldn't do that. Maybe this couldn't have been avoided. Maybe Putin had this in mind all along. but it was certainly worth a try, because look what's happening now, and this was predictable. But that leads us to some other points that we need to discuss. How do we get out of this? One of the fears we have is that Russia never took, the United States and the West never took what Putin said over and over again in his warnings seriously. I hope we're not doing the same thing with China. I hope we're not doing the same thing with the South China Sea, but even more importantly, with Taiwan. Because for months before this crisis erupted, it was all about Taiwan and what would happen if uh, if China moved against Taiwan. Well, China holds the key, in my mind, to dealing with both crises right now, because China is the one country that has very good relations with both Ukraine and with Russia. China has said beforehand that it respects Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. China has extensive trade and economic relations with Ukraine. Ukraine is in some ways the Western outpost of China's Belt and Road policy, Belt and Road Initiative. So China's got very good relations with Ukraine. China also, of course, has close friendly relations with Russia, not a military alliance, but close economic ties and political ties. Xi Jinping has said that Putin is his closest friend in the world. And he says that he agrees with Russia about NATO expansion. They align themselves against the West because they see the West as negating and undermining both of their national security interests. And uh, so, uh, and also, China is Putin's lifeline. As the sanctions crash down and destroy the Russian economy, as the ruble becomes worthless, as Russia's economy shrinks further and further, and Russian people are suffering as they're cut off from the rest of the world, diplomatically, culturally, and economically. China is their lifeline, and China has increased economic ties, increased oil and gas imports, uh, even as it has begun. Xi Jinping has got leverage. Now, why is it in his interest to do this? You could say that it might be in his interest to see NATO be at war and the United States be at war, but it's not in his interest. China has benefited for 30 years by peace in the West. China's economy has skyrocketed. China's economy is going to be hurt by this. China has good relations with much of Europe, but uh, China is perceived very negatively throughout the West. In the U.S., for example, more than 70% of the people have a very negative image of China. How does China reverse that? Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping if can position himself as the savior, as the peacemaker, as the diplomat, as the visionary, as the man who can deliver peace to the world. He will be seen heroically throughout the West. If Biden were a statesman, he would be on the phone with Xi Jinping offering economic concessions if Xi Jinping will play that role. Biden can say, I'm going to call off our trade war. I'm going to call off our policy of hostility. If the West really is concerned about the fate of the Ukrainian people and those refugees, we see more than 2 million or so refugees, and there are going to be millions more. See the suffering of the Ukrainian people. If they really care about that, they'll reach out to China, give China more concessions, and China, even in terms of their friendship with Putin, this is an absolute disaster for Russia as it is now. The best thing China could do for Russia would be to force Putin's hand. If Putin can't see Russia's own best interest, China can see it for him. And so this is a win-win for everybody. And I was on Chinese TV yesterday morning talking about Foreign Minister Wang Yi's big speech at the National Convention. And Wang Yi said all the right things about China trying to encourage peace, acting as a peacemaker. But I said what he needs is a little bit more urgency, or a lot more urgency. And that China's got to act aggressively and force the issue. I'm going to go on Chinese TV again this evening. And again, I'm going to make the point even stronger. This is absolutely in China's interest, and it's also in the world's interest. And China wants to reverse this image on the global stage. This is exactly how to do it. And I hope my German friends and others will put pressure on China to do that now. Don't talk about punishing Russia, and toppling Putin. The immediate concern now is ending this war as quickly as possible. I mean, those are really good questions, and I would love to address them with you on another occasion when there's not a war going on. You and I spent years talking about NATO expansion, NATO encroachment, the West's ongoing effort to marginalize, demonize, weaken Russia. The West has reaped much of that, of what it was doing, and and bears a lot of responsibility for what's happening now. Western media has been incredibly one-sided and a source of great misinformation for a long time. You mentioned Yemen. What is it? 300,000 Yemenis dead now, killed mostly with American weapons of war. Uh, did any of these people who called for sanctions against Russia, did they call for sanctions against the United States after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, Iraq, or Libya? Of course not. We know that there's a double standard. However, what's happening now is that Russia has committed the worst of all war crimes. That Russia has invaded a sovereign country, done it so under the same false pretenses that the United States has done. When I see the parallels, we could draw them all day. What was the excuse that the United States used for the invasion of Iraq? That Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, that we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, that all those things that Cheney and Bush and Libby and Wolfowitz and Rice said. Putin has learned from their playbook. Putin is now saying, we don't want the smoking gun to be a nuclear cloud done by the Ukrainians, So, uh, but we have to now really focus on the immediate crisis. And so what we focused on before about NATO, uh, what NATO did to create a global crisis, now is almost irrelevant in terms of the immediate today's situation of what we have to deal with. But it becomes relevant in terms of the post-war architecture, because if we don't learn from that, we're not going to be able to create a peaceful, enduring, stable world that benefits everybody, that benefits the Russians, that benefits the Ukrainians, that benefits the Germans, that benefits the Americans, that benefits the Yemenis. We have a lot to deal with, We've got to deal with climate change. We've got to deal with global health. We've got to deal with the gap between rich and poor. We've got to deal with the massive waste on armaments. In the United States, there are some people calling for doubling America's military spending. I mean, it's not going to go up that much, but there are going to be significant increases. And Germany is talking about going beyond 2% of its economy now, its GDP, on military spending, remilitarizing, something the Germans have been resisting for decades and decades and decades. And so this has had devastating repercussions globally. Once we end this fighting, let's address all of that. But right now, the immediate uh, goal, urgent mission for all of us who believe in peace, hate to see warfare, hate to see the militarists being proven right and the Russia haters being proven right. The goal for us now is to stop this fighting immediately and then go on to create a different kind of world.